I grew up a patriot. I grew up the son of a patriot. So we always had that mindset that when your country calls on you, regardless of what the cause is, that you answer the call. And that people do die here, okay, and people do get maimed here. And say, hey, you know, I bought the ticket, I take the ride, I have to expect whatever cards are going to be dealt to me, and don't expect this to be an easy trip. That's what you're trained for. That's what you expect. But reality was here.
Roger, that was some sort of rifle grenade that came all the way through the building, hit over the line. Have you pushed forward?
As the Vietnamese people celebrated Tet, their most important holiday, the night of January 31st, 1968, brought one of the largest and most coordinated offensives of the entire war. Across South Vietnam, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launched simultaneous attacks on cities and towns. But nowhere did the fighting prove more intense, prolonged, and costly than in the ancient imperial capital of Hue. Within just a few hours, a city that had largely been spared the devastation of war was transformed into a battlefield, and that battle would last for more than a month.
But there was no real rear echelons in Vietnam. You were basically surrounded, no matter where you were at, okay? The so-called enemy, okay, was all around you. Well, we received rocket and sniper fire while we were there, which was pretty good orientation for the new guys.
Hue was no ordinary city. For centuries, it had been the imperial capital of Vietnam. It was a place of history, culture, and national pride. Yet, in the early hours of that Tet morning, the war that many Americans believed was nearly over came crashing into its streets with shocking force. What happened in Hue would become one of the longest and bloodiest battles of the Vietnam War, and one that would deeply shake American confidence in the conflict. But the attack on Hue was no ordinary assault. For months, the communists had been preparing in secret. Hundreds of Viet Cong soldiers had slipped into the city disguised as civilians and pilgrims coming for the Tet celebrations. They brought weapons and ammunition hidden in carts, trucks, and bags of rice. Everything was carefully timed for the biggest holiday of the year, when the city's defenders would be at their weakest.
I started throwing the grenades, okay, over the slope, and just laid back, locked and loaded, and waited for them to come. Sometimes it seems in slow motion, but yet it happens so quick.
On the night of January 30th into the early morning hours of January 31st, the communists struck with shocking speed. At around 3:40 a.m., rockets and mortars began falling from the mountains to the west. That was the signal. Within hours, thousands of North Vietnamese army troops and Viet Cong fighters poured into the city from multiple directions. By dawn, the situation was dire. The gold-starred flag of the National Liberation Front was flying high over the ancient Citadel, the symbolic heart of Hue. The old imperial capital, a city that had largely been spared the worst of the war until then, was suddenly under communist control. Government buildings, police stations, and key positions fell one after another. The defenders were caught completely off guard. Many South Vietnamese soldiers were on holiday leave for Tet. The American advisors at the MACV compound, just south of the Perfume River, found themselves surrounded and fighting for their lives. The ARVN 1st Division headquarters inside the Citadel was one of the few positions that held out, but it was under heavy pressure. What followed was some of the most brutal urban combat American forces had ever faced. The Marines who rushed in from nearby bases quickly realized this was not the kind of fighting they were used to in the jungle. This was house-to-house, street-by-street fighting in a densely populated city filled with narrow alleys, thick walls, and hidden positions.
So you would have this position, which would be pretty much an uncomfortable position, because if anything happened, in many instances, the guys who were in those positions, if that position couldn't be held, or if they couldn't race back to the defenses of getting behind the wire before the so-called shit hit the fan, okay, and everybody started shooting at each other, then you were pretty much caught in a crossfire. So your position was to get as many grenades out, empty your magazines, try to radio in that you were coming in at a certain fixed point before you did get caught in that crossfire and can conceivably killed by your own your own friendly fire as well as enemy fire.
Every building, every corner, every rooftop could hide an enemy. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong had prepared well. They had dug in deep, using the ancient walls of the Citadel and the modern buildings south of the river to their advantage. They fought with determination, knowing the symbolic importance of holding the old imperial capital. For the American Marines and their South Vietnamese allies, the battle quickly turned into a nightmare of close-quarters combat. Tanks moved slowly down streets, providing cover for infantry. Marines had to clear buildings room by room, often using grenades and satchel charges. The fighting was slow, costly, and exhausting. And yet, despite the initial shock, the Marines and ARVN forces began to push back. What started as a desperate defense soon became a determined effort to retake the city. But no one on either side could have imagined just how long and bloody this battle would become.
Because they were good. They were real good. They practiced getting into you, okay, as quickly as they can without being detected. Because obviously once they were detected, then the game was pretty much over. But then again, the game was never really over without us paying a price.
The battle was becoming a grinding war of attrition. The city that had once been known for its beauty and history was slowly being reduced to rubble. Yet the Marines and their South Vietnamese allies refused to give up. They continued to advance, block by block, determined to retake every inch of Hue, no matter the cost.
They finally made their way into my location. I still don't realize that I'm hit. It was just about that time where they sent the first wave at us.
The battle for Hue also highlighted how American forces adapted their tactics and weapons to fight in a dense urban environment, something they had rarely done on this scale before. The Marines who fought in the city quickly learned that the weapons and methods they had used in the jungles and rice paddies were often not effective in the narrow streets and thick-walled buildings of Hue. The standard infantry weapon for most Marines was the M16 rifle. While reliable in open terrain, the M16 sometimes struggled in the close quarters fighting inside buildings, where its 5.56 millimeter round could pass through walls without stopping the enemy.
Very horrifying, needless to say. War is horror. There was a lot of death, a lot of maiming. It was not a very good time.
Many Marines also carried the older M19 11.45 caliber pistol as a backup, which proved more effective at very close range. Machine gunners relied heavily on the M60, a belt-fed 7.62 millimeter machine gun that provided crucial suppressive fire during advances down streets and through open areas. One of the most important weapons in the urban fighting turned out to be the M79 grenade launcher, nicknamed the Blooper. Its 40 millimeter grenades could be fired into windows and doorways from a safe distance, clearing enemy positions without exposing Marines to direct fire. Marines also made extensive use of hand grenades and satchel charges. Powerful explosive packs that were thrown or placed against walls and doors to blast holes for entry or to collapse fortified positions. Tanks played a vital role in the battle. The M48 Patton tanks of the Marine Corps moved through the streets of Hue, providing mobile firepower and protection for the infantry. Their 90mm main guns could destroy enemy strongpoints in buildings, while their machine guns suppressed enemy fighters on rooftops. However, the narrow streets and rubble made it difficult for tanks to maneuver, and they often became targets for rocket-propelled grenades and B-40 rockets.
When was most of your fighting, during the daytime or at night, or just any time? You could break out at any time. And did you get a lot of sleep or not much sleep? Or?
I became very bitter. I lost my mentor, Sergeant Alex Fedorov, was killed on February 20th, 1968.
Because of the dense urban terrain and poor weather, close air support from fighter jets was limited during much of the battle. Low clouds and rain often prevented aircraft from accurately striking targets. Instead, the Marines relied heavily on artillery and naval gunfire. Artillery units positioned outside the city fired thousands of rounds in support of the advancing troops. Even more important was the naval gunfire from U.S. Navy ships stationed off the coast. Large caliber guns from cruisers and destroyers could deliver devastating fire into the city from several miles away, breaking up enemy concentrations and destroying fortified positions. Tactics evolved quickly out of necessity. The Marines learned to advance methodically, using tanks and machine guns to suppress enemy fire, while small teams of infantry cleared buildings.
So it was not a good time to be in Vietnam. I don't think any time was a good time to be in Vietnam, especially 1968 was when they had the Tet Offensive. That was a huge counterattack by the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army, and they killed a lot of our guys. And I was in the middle of that battle, the Battle of Hue.
They often used tear gas to force enemies out of buildings before entering. Flamethrowers were sometimes employed to clear fortified positions where grenades and explosives proved ineffective. The fighting was slow and deliberate. Marines would secure one building, then move to the next, always watching for ambushes from above or from adjacent structures. In the Citadel, the challenges were even greater. The thick stone walls and narrow passages made it extremely difficult to use tanks or heavy vehicles effectively. Marines had to rely more on infantry tactics, supported by artillery and naval gunfire. They used ladders to scale walls, blasted holes through buildings with explosives, and fought in extremely close quarters. The enemy had prepared defensive positions in almost every structure, forcing the Marines to clear each room individually. Throughout the battle, the Marines maintained pressure on the enemy by coordinating infantry advances with continuous artillery and naval bombardment. This combined arms approach allowed them to slowly grind down the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong defenses. Although progress was slow and costly, this methodical use of firepower and infantry eventually allowed them to retake the city. Reinforcements were on the way, but the situation was critical. Marines from the 1st Marine Division, based at Phu Bai, just 8 miles south, were rushed forward to help. What they encountered as they entered the southern part of Hue was a type of fighting they had never prepared for. The city had become a deadly maze. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong had taken strong defensive positions in buildings, behind walls, and on rooftops. The Marines had to fight their way forward under constant fire, often with little room to maneuver. Tanks moved slowly down narrow streets trying to provide cover, while infantry cleared structures one by one. One of the first major objectives was the MACV compound, where a small group of American advisors had been holding out against repeated attacks. The Marines fought their way to them through heavy resistance. But even after linking up, the fighting did not stop. The enemy was well dug in and determined to hold every inch of ground. Meanwhile, north of the Perfume River, The battle for the ancient Citadel was turning into one of the most difficult operations the Marines had ever faced. The old walled city, with its thick fortifications and narrow streets, had become a fortress. The North Vietnamese had turned every building, every gate, and every tower into a defensive position. Progress was measured not in blocks, but in buildings, and sometimes even in single rooms. The Marines pushed forward day after day, supported by artillery and naval gunfire from ships offshore. But the dense urban terrain made air support difficult, and the enemy was fighting with skill and determination, knowing the symbolic importance of holding the old imperial capital. When the Marines and South Vietnamese forces finally began to push the enemy out of the Citadel and reclaim the city, they started to uncover the true horror of what had happened during the weeks of communist occupation. As they moved through the streets and cleared buildings, they came across scenes that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. In the days and weeks after the fighting ended, dozens of mass graves were discovered around Hue. The bodies of thousands of civilians were found, men, women, and even children. Many had been bound and shot. Others showed signs of torture. These were not soldiers. They were ordinary people, government workers, teachers, doctors, priests, students, and anyone the communists considered a threat or a traitor to their cause. It became clear that while the battle was raging, political officers of the Viet Cong had been carrying out a systematic campaign of terror behind the lines. They had prepared lists in advance. As soon as they took control of neighborhoods, they began rounding up people whose names appeared on those lists. The victims were taken to schools, prisons, or remote areas outside the city, where they were interrogated, tortured, and executed. Some were buried alive, others were shot and thrown into pits. The full scale of the killings only became known gradually. Bodies continued to be found for months after the battle. In some graves, more than 100 people were buried together. In total, between 3,000 and 5,000 civilians are believed to have been murdered during the communist occupation of Hue. For the people of the city, and for the soldiers who discovered the graves, it was a shocking revelation of what the enemy was willing to do. At the same time, the physical destruction of Hue was almost beyond belief. The once beautiful imperial capital had been turned into a wasteland. Large parts of the old citadel were reduced to rubble. The modern section south of the river had also suffered heavy damage from artillery, airstrikes, and close quarters fighting. Entire neighborhoods were destroyed. The smell of death and burning buildings hung over the city for weeks. As the Marines moved through the ruins, they found evidence of how the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong had prepared for the battle. They discovered fortified positions inside schools, hospitals, and temples. They found large caches of weapons, ammunition, and supplies that had been hidden before the attack. It became clear that the communists had planned to hold the city for a long time and had brought in enough men and material to sustain a prolonged fight. The Marines also saw the human cost up close. They came across civilians who had been caught in the crossfire or deliberately targeted. Some had been used as human shields. Others had simply been in the wrong place when the fighting swept through their streets. The soldiers were forced to confront the reality that in this kind of urban warfare, there were no clean victories and very few innocent bystanders left untouched. As the battle progressed, the Marines refined their tactics based on hard experience. They learned to use tanks more effectively by pairing them closely with infantry teams. The tanks would blast holes in buildings or walls, after which small groups of Marines would rush in to clear the structure before the enemy could reorganize. This combined arms approach became essential in the narrow streets of Hue, where movement was restricted and the enemy could easily ambush isolated units. Artillery and naval gunfire played an increasingly important role as the battle went on. Forward observers moved with the infantry, calling in precise fire missions on enemy positions. Because air support was often limited by weather, the Marines came to rely heavily on the big guns of U.S. Navy ships offshore. These ships could deliver heavy and accurate fire into the city from several miles away, breaking up enemy strongpoints and suppressing fire from rooftops and fortified buildings. The weather remained a constant challenge throughout February. Marines fought in wet uniforms, often without adequate resupply for days at a time. The poor visibility also made it harder to coordinate movements between units, increasing the risk of friendly fire incidents in the confused urban environment. Despite these difficulties, the Marines continued to advance methodically. In the southern part of the city, they gradually cleared one block after another, pushing the enemy back toward the river. They also made greater use of tear gas to drive enemy fighters out of buildings before entering. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong, for their part, adapted their own tactics as the battle continued. They used the dense urban terrain to their advantage, setting up ambushes in alleys and firing from upper floors and rooftops. They also employed snipers and small teams armed with rocket-propelled grenades to target tanks and armored vehicles. However, as their supplies dwindled and their casualties mounted, their ability to mount coordinated counterattacks diminished. By mid-February, the balance of the battle had clearly shifted in favor of the Marines and South Vietnamese forces. The enemy was being steadily pushed into smaller and smaller pockets within the Citadel. Although fierce fighting continued, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Americans had learned hard lessons about urban warfare and were applying them with increasing effectiveness. The battle for Hue left a deep mark on the United States. For months, American leaders had told the public that the war was being won and that the enemy was growing weaker. The sudden and prolonged fighting in Hue shattered that narrative. Images of Marines battling in the streets of an ancient city and reports of heavy casualties reached American living rooms night after night. Many people who had supported the war began to question whether victory was truly possible. The impact was felt in Washington. President Lyndon Johnson, who had steadily increased American involvement in Vietnam, was deeply affected by the Tet Offensive and the battle for Hue. Just 2 months after the fighting ended, he announced that he would not seek re-election. The war had become deeply unpopular at home, and the long, costly struggle in Hue played a significant role in turning public opinion against it. For the Marines who fought in Hue, the battle remained one of the defining experiences of their service. They had faced some of the most intense urban combat of the war and had paid a heavy price in blood. Many carried the memories of those weeks with them for the rest of their lives, memories of close quarters fighting, of comrades lost, and of a city slowly being destroyed around them. The cost to Hue itself was enormous. In the end, the fight for Hue showed the true nature of the war in Vietnam, a long, grinding conflict where even hard-won victories came at a terrible price. The Marines and South Vietnamese forces had retaken the city, but the battle had also revealed the determination of the enemy and the difficulty of achieving a decisive victory. More than 50 years later, the battle for Hue is remembered as one of the most important and costly engagements of the Vietnam War. It is remembered for the courage of the Marines who fought there, for the suffering of the civilian population, and for the way it changed how many Americans viewed the war. The men who fought in those streets did so with determination and sacrifice, and their service deserves to be remembered.
I'm put in this primitive situation to have to do something yet for my country, okay, of this nature, because I am a true patriot. And they says this is the right thing to do, okay? This is oppressing communism. This is to stop the flow of communism, because half of this country does not want to be communist. They want to be free people. But looking up at the moon and saying to myself, here we can have the technology to put somebody up there, but we do not have the G2 or the brains to negotiate our way out of something like this.